Throughout the course of this lecture, we'll trace the history of populism in Latin America, a region which De la Torre calls the land of populism. Now, whilst Latin America is strictly shorthand for those countries which speak Romance-based languages, the term here is useful for all countries south of the US, with a particular focus on South America pictured. In the case of Latin America, from the 1930s and 40s until the present, populist leaders had dominated the region's political landscapes, partly due to populist actors' roles in challenging established patterns of elite rule and helping to usher in new eras of democracy. For example, the classic examples of populist actors in Latin America, Juan Aníbal Perón in Argentina, Getulio Vargas in Brazil, Victor Raúl Haya de la Torre in Peru, or José María Velasco Ibarra in Ecuador are all associated with the struggle for free and open elections and the opening up of the democratic sphere. As such, populist movements and later populist governments were present at the emergence of democracy for many Latin American countries, which produced deep-lasting political loyalties and cleavages, which to some extent still exist today, and indeed are reflected in the modern, or were reflected in modern radical populists like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador. Now, whereas we in Europe have seen populism as a sort of negative emergence within a kind of liberal democratic sphere, something that challenges that, we can see why in Latin America, and for scholars who begin their understanding of populism in Latin America, would see it as a positive movement, and this is especially true for Laclau and Mouffe and their kind of discursive understanding of populism. So these modern radical populists can trace their ideological lineage back to those of the 1930s and 40s and polarised their polities and the academic community into those who regarded them as democratic innovators and those who consider them a threat to democracy. However, as we will see, the fact that populists have been on the side of democracy against the oligarchic elites by forming a united will of the people against oligarchs does not mean they're necessarily an ally of social movements, indigenous peoples, or liberal democracy. Hence, populism is often a top-down form of mobilisation, i.e. it will originate from a personalistic leader, and this clashes with bottom-up forms of mobilisation, so social movement organisations, those which push for plurinationalism, i.e. the idea of coexistence of two or more preserved national groups within a polity, the most famous example being Bolivia, which is actually called the plurinational state of Bolivia, and kind of contrasts with that idea that we have of a nation finding a home in a state and a state representing one nation. Anyway, but there is the potential for civil society to work with populists and to let them push for their agenda, but despite the clear tension, right? And so there's almost a strategic decision for civil society, for business, for whatever. Do they want a pluralistic society where they are one of many actors, and they might win some debates or lose some debates? Or do they want to throw their lot in with a populist and either be very close to power, or if the populist leader changes or they fall out of fashion, have no power? The historical culture of Latin America is also important, right? So it is often seen as a home of populism, and for some, this emerges from popular stories and myths surrounding Simón Bolívar, known as the Liberator, who was a Venezuelan military and political leader who led the secession of modern-day Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama from the Spanish Empire, right? And this legacy allows the political imagination to be drawn to the idea of a single leader or a lone protector who can defend or free the nation. So in this lecture, we'll look at three types of populism in Latin America, following a broadly chronological structure. And that is the first, classical populism, which represents the first incorporation of previously excluded people into the national community through an expansion of the franchise, and in more developed countries it enforced import substitution policies, i.e. we won't import goods from outside, we'll make them ourselves, often with disastrous consequences. Then we have neoliberal populism, which used discourses against political parties, portraying them as oligarchic cliques that have illegally appropriated the people's sovereignty. Now, unlike with classical populists, these neoliberal populists did not create social polarization or cleavages, just political differences. It tended to bring new people to the political system, those who worked in the informal sector outside of the working or middle class organisations. And these policies, or the policies of neoliberal populists, abandoned nationalism, pursued the opening of their economies to international markets, and reduced the size of the state, but not within a liberal democratic framework. And then we have radical populists. These are similar to classical populists in their politicisation of social and economic exclusions. They created new political and social cleavages. They linked neoliberalism with traditional parties, with liberal democracy, and used that as the basis of them, in the kind of them-us populist rhetoric. In mineral-rich nations such as Venezuela, Ecuador and Bolivia, these radical populists reversed neoliberal policies and implemented nationalist and redistributive policies based on mineral resource rent. Popular organisations were subordinated to the will of leaders, and atmospheres of political confrontation and polarisation were created. And also, as we go through, it's important for you to draw out comparisons with cases that we've previously covered, so in America and across Europe at the moment. Classical populism emerged in a context where Latin American states nominally had liberal constitutions but were ran as illiberal oligarchic regimes, where the vast majority were excluded from politics. As societies became more urbanised, industrialised and middle class, and oligarchic leaders became more and more inept at running their countries, gaps in the market opened for populist leaders to emerge. Typically, populist leaders emerge through fighting for liberal democratic ideas, such as against electoral fraud and an expansion of the franchise. However, given the differing levels of development across Latin America, different patterns of classical populists emerged. In economically developed nations such as Argentina, Brazil and Mexico, populist presidents pursued nationalist and redistributive social policies that coincided with the period of import substitution industrialization, ISI, a policy which argues that foreign imports, just imports because there's no other type, foreign imports should be replaced with domestic production. This was typically coupled with state planning in the economy and the protection of infant industries. Although this may create jobs in the short term, it meant that, protected from international competition, firms became inefficient and unproductive, and often sites of corruption vis-à-vis politicians or the state. Some studies even found that ISI increased inequality in Latin America, since internal demand was insufficient to maintain companies. Populism also emerged in agrarian contexts. In Bolivia, Ecuador and Peru, populism was not linked to industrialization, even though, as in the industrializing republics, it led to the political inclusion of previously excluded actors, specifically electors. However, in all cases, although classical populist leaders held up workers as the core or the soul of their respective nations, they simultaneously repressed or co-opted labour groups, trade unions, whilst workers had to strategically use populist openings to press for reforms or demands against specific bosses or elites, rather than nationwide economic change. Another tactic of classical populists was to turn elements of the life of the poor, which were typically stigmatised, into virtues, e.g., terms which were previously negatively racially loaded became used positively by populist leaders. Classical populists were often effective in opening up the democratic sphere, especially through widening the franchise, e.g., voter turnout during Perón's first government grew from 18 to 50% of the population, and women won the right to vote. However, the rule of law was still weak. Populist leaders preferred to dress like, speak like and act like the people through mass rallies rather than institutionalise popular participation and the rule of law. And so we have democracy, but not liberal democracy. However, or as a result, the mobilisation was used to support an authoritarian appropriation of the people's will. The people's will was not given institutional channels to express itself, free and fair elections, referenda, etc., but populists instead relied on mass rally attendance to signal approval. Moreover, due to the Manichaean discourse, and the resulting polarisation of political and social cleavages, populist movements resembled situations of war. The foes and friends of populism saw each other as enemies rather than democratic rivals who seek negotiations and agreements, and hence classical populist leaders were no friends of organisational or civil society autonomy. Neoliberalism or neoliberal populism might seem like a strange phrase, but some scholars have classified Berlusconi's Forza Italia as a neoliberal populist party, and some on the left have also ascribed that label more often as an accusation than anything else to UKIP as well. But it's strange, we don't often think of neoliberal populists, but they existed. In contrast to classical populism, which brought marginalised people into the political community, neoliberal populism took place in the 1990s in nations where most had the right to vote already and people were organising within political parties. Leaders such as Carlos Menem in Argentina, top left, or Alberto Fujimori in Peru, top right, were elected after the failure of import substitution industrialization led to economic catastrophes, and inflation reached 30 to 50% per month. These populists blamed traditional politicians, unsurprisingly, arguing that they had appropriated the people's sovereignty and led their countries into economic chaos. Some neoliberal populists like Fujimori and Fernando Collor de Mello in Brazil, bottom left, ran as a political outsider. Others like Menem got into power against the wishes of their party's leadership. Think of Trump. And Bala Bucaram in Ecuador, bottom right, used his personalistic party to challenge the political establishment. So the routes to power may have been different, but the underlying grievances were broadly similar. Firstly, political parties and elites were portrayed not only as out of touch with the needs and desires of the electorate, but also set up as enemies of the people. There was also an element of racial politics involved. For example, Fujimori and Bucaram were elected as symbols of the rejection of traditional white political elites. For example, when the right-wing presidential candidate was asked about Fujimori, he replied, "But nobody knows that Chinito," which means little Chinaman. The next day, Fujimori opened a major rally in a shanty town with the phrase, "Here we are, the Chinitos and the Cholitos," which is kind of means like por mesitos, which is like kind of mixed heritage. And Fujimori chose a simple slogan, "A president like you." So you can see how, like I mentioned earlier, these populists took phrases that were supposed to be slurs and used them to their advantage to show authenticity with the people. As such, populists would frame their position as a confrontation between the white elite, or largely white elite, and the non-white common people. This was effective because it tapped into how indigenous peoples and those of immigrant background were often discriminated against by these traditional white elites. Similarly, after Ecuador's former right-wing president Leon Febres Cordero stated in 1996 that the voters for Bucaram were a bunch of prostitutes and thieves, Bucaram transformed the meaning of these insults used to describe his base of support by saying that the only prostitutes and thieves were members of the Ecuadorian oligarchy. Fernando Collor, bottom left, cultivated the image of a young and energetic political outsider, a saviour acting above and beyond the interests of workers' unions or employers' associations. His mission was to destroy the privileges of inefficient bureaucrats, to bring redemption to his followers and the country. Once in power, these leaders abandoned the nationalist and statist policies of their classical predecessors. They shrank the size of the state and they opened economies. In many instances, they privatised what their populist predecessors had nationalised. Draconian shock treatments brought inflation down in Argentina and Peru. In Argentina, it fell from 3,079% to 8% between 1989 and 1994, whilst in Peru it declined from 7,650% to under 40% from 1990 to 1993. However, not all neoliberal populists fared the same. Those without an institutional power base, Abdallah Bucaram in Ecuador, scarcely lasted 6 months and was removed by Congress on questionable legal grounds that he was mentally incapable of governing. Fernando Collor in Brazil similarly had a weak support base in the legislature and could not survive corruption scandals. He lasted just over 2 years. On the other hand, Menem and Fujimori were both re-elected. They had support bases, they had success in reducing hyperinflation, and they were able to use the funds from privatisation to pursue patronage and clientelism. However, ultimately, Fujimori ended up in prison relating to corruption and electoral fraud, and Menem's bid for a third term was ruled unconstitutional. Neoliberal populism had a variety of effects on nations. For example, in Argentina, Peronism became less antagonistic and confrontational, and thus more compatible with liberal democracy because it realised it had to play within the rules of the game. On the other hand, Fujimori's regime attacked and destroyed liberal democratic institutions. Fujimori denounced members of Congress as unproductive charlatans, Congress as a large, heavy, thick-skinned pachyderm, and judges as jackals. Fujimori belittled not only existing political parties, but also the concept of parties. They were palabreria, all talk and no action. To surmise, neoliberal populists use discourses against political parties, portraying them as oligarchic cliques that have illegally appropriated the people's sovereignty. Differently from classical populist experiences, where political schism led to social polarisation, these movements and regimes were confined to political divisions. In some cases, such as Fujimori's Peru, neoliberal populism led to the destruction of previously existing political party systems. Similarly to classical populism, it included previously excluded people, this time those who made a living in the informal sector and were not part of working or middle class organisations. As with classical populism, it led to the renewal of economic elites as business people without social recognition sought to be accepted as equals by well-established elites. Even though in their rhetoric they focused on the values of the common people, portrayed as the essence of the nation, their policies abandoned nationalism, pursued the opening of their economies in international markets, and reduced the size of the state. Three factors help explain the turn to the left and the re-emergence of radical populism in Latin America. So the first one is political representation. There was a sense of a crisis when it came to political representation, affecting both political parties and the framework of democracy itself. Parties were perceived as instruments of local and foreign elites that implemented neoliberal policies, increasing social inequality. These leaders rose to power with platforms that promised to wipe away corrupt politicians and traditional parties, to experiment with participatory forms of democracy, and to implement policies to redistribute income. For radical populists, the idea of the old leftist utopias of socialism and revolution were key, but were given a new twist. Instead of violent revolution, these leaders advocated for the revolutionary role of constituent power. Constituent power was understood as a revolutionary force that ought to be permanently activated to found again from scratch all the corrupt political institutions which served the interests of foreign powers and local elites. They were elected with the promise to convene constitutional assemblies that, with the participation of social movements and common citizens, were tasked to draft new constitutions. The new constitutions expanded citizens' rights while simultaneously concentrating political power in the executive, headed by the Populists. There was also the resistance to neoliberalism. So when citizens protested against neoliberal policies, as well as corruption, elites painted protesters as savage and uncivilized rabbles that invaded centres of civility. These constructions of the poor as a rabble and the antithesis to reason and civilized behaviour allowed or justified the state's fierce and brutal repression, which often ended in the deaths of the poor. For example, in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, who led a failed coup in 1992, was elected in 1998 with the promise to get rid of neoliberalism and the cartel of corrupt politicians. In Ecuador, between 1997 and 2005, 3 elected presidents were deposed in events where social movements and citizens occupied public spaces to protest against neoliberalism and political corruption. In 2006, Rafael Correa, a college professor who never belonged to a political party, was elected in 2006 with a platform to reverse neoliberalism, also to convene a constituent assembly and to revive national sovereignty. In Bolivia, a cycle of protest and political turmoil brought to the end a party system which had been established since 1985, as well as the neoliberal economic model. coalitions of urban and rural indigenous organisations, cocoa growers and middle-class sectors fought against water privatisation, increasing taxation, the forced eradication of cocoa leaves, and the surrender of gas reserves to multinational interests. Democratic legitimacy was understood to lie in crowd action, where the people directly expressed its sovereignty. The state increasingly relied on repression, in turn radicalising the protesters. The insurgents accomplished their goals of getting rid of the neoliberal model, defending Bolivia's natural resources when Evo Morales was elected president in 2005. There was also a strain of anti-Americanism. That citizens perceived politicians and neoliberal elites had surrendered national sovereignty to the IMF, to the World Bank, and to the US government. Venezuela had changed its pro-third world foreign policy and become an advocate of neoliberal reform and free trade. In a desperate move to stop hyperinflation in 2000, Ecuador had given up its national currency, the sucre, for the US dollar. Bolivia had undergone social strife and humanitarian rights abuses as the military unsuccessfully followed US policies of forceful eradication of cocoa leaf production. Now, radical populists promised to bring back the interests of the nation-state and to build a multipolar world. So they are nationalists. They had anti-globalization and anti-United States postures at the core of their foreign policy, both rhetoric and strategies, often using the US or their organizations as a rhetorical other which seeks to harm the interests of the pure people. So there were similarities with other eras of populism. Despite the important differences, these leaders represent a new and distinct phase of radical populism in the region. Leaders emerged in permanent political campaigns, using the convening of frequent elections to displace older elites, rally supporters, and consolidate hegemony. Secondly, these leaders claimed to be the embodiment of superior forms of democracy that would solve participatory and representative deficits of liberal democracy and fulfill the democratizing goal of promoting equality and social justice. An example of this is seen in Ecuador's Correa, who saw the essence of democratic citizenship residing in a socio-economic sphere and dependent upon state policies to achieve social justice. For Chavez and Maduro, advancing democracy depended on replacing the unresponsive institutions of liberal democracy with new forms of direct participatory democracy. For Morales, democracy meant replacing and/or complementing liberal institutions with forms of indigenous communal democracy designed to enhance indigenous participation. One example of this is the power given to constituent assemblies, which were entrusted to refound the nation through new constitutions. De la Torre argues that the aim is to establish a different kind of democracy based on elections, but also on a new constitutional order that concentrates power in the hands of the president. Majoritarian mobilization, led by a personalistic leader, took precedence over checks and balances and respect for basic civil rights inherent in liberal democracy. In emphasizing substantive democracy, all three regimes relied on state intervention in the economy in the name of redistributing wealth and reducing poverty and inequality. Although this statist, redistributionist aspect of populism is not new, governments in Venezuela, Bolivia and Ecuador were rich in hydrocarbons and reaped huge benefits from the commodity boom of the 2000s that sent oil and natural gas prices to record levels. As a result of enhanced revenues, public investment and social spending skyrocketed, and poverty rates and, to a lesser extent, inequality fell when the price of oil and other commodities were high. Populist social programs had the advantage of rapidly targeting the poor. Such programs served to boost the popularity of presidents and functioned as a visible instrument for maintaining power. At the same time, they suffered from major flaws in design. Social programs were haphazard and politicized. They lacked efficiency, transparency, and institutionalization. Because they were tied to the persona of the president, who distributes benefits primarily to their political supporters rather than on the basis of universal objective criteria, programs were unlikely to survive beyond the mandate of a particular government. The fiscal foundations of these social programs, especially those that rely heavily on oil and other windfall commodity rents, were unsustainable in the long run. Falling prices of oil led to dramatic increases in poverty in Venezuela. In 2015, the level of poverty was 45%, 3 points higher than when Chavez was first elected in 1998. So in many ways, the populist economic miracle was built on sand, or oil. There are differences, though, in how these governments were linked with social movements. Evo Morales came to power at the peak of indigenous-led popular protest against neoliberalism and pacted democracy. Morales' party, the Movement for Socialism, was the political instrument of strong social movements who could hold the president to account in some ways. Participation in Bolivia was to a large extent grounded in communitarian traditions, where all participate and deliberate until a decision is made. Leaders at all levels were accountable to their social base. Participation under Morales was a more bottom-up process, and organisations of the subaltern had the capacity to force government to reverse policies. Morales was often kept in check by these movements. Correa, however, was elected when the indigenous movement entered into a crisis, temporarily losing its capacity to engage in sustained action. And the fact that the Ecuadorian opposition was too weak and fragmented meant the reorganisation of society and the mobilisation of people only really occurred around election times. In Venezuela, social movements were never as strong as the other case studies. And the exclusion of the informal sector from corporatist organisations during the reign of the two-party system allowed Chavez to create organisations of the subaltern from the top down. However, it's important to remember that these citizens were not just passive instruments to be used by populists. Unsurprisingly, the populist view of homogeneous and inherently virtuous people contributed to the creation of authoritarian governments in Venezuela and Ecuador. Chavez claimed to be the embodiment of the Venezuelan people. This is not about Hugo Chavez, this is about a people, he said. And because his mission was to redeem people from oppression, he could say, I demand absolute loyalty to me. I am not an individual, I am the people. Similarly, after winning his second presidential election in 2009, Rafael Correa asserted Ecuador voted for itself. Bolivia is somewhat different, however. In Bolivia, who can speak on behalf of the Bolivian people is contested between powerful social movements and Evo Morales, who at times had tried to embody the will of a unitary people. The Constitution of 2009 declared Bolivia a plurinational and communitarian state. The MAS, the Movement for Socialism, did not use exclusionary ethnic appeals. On the contrary, they constructed the notion of people as multi-ethnic and plural. Perhaps some parallels with Podemos here, and perhaps the SNP, although the SNP seems to be slowly moving towards a nastier form of anti-English sentiment, or at least that is coming to the fore. Also see some of the campaign material that Alex Salmond and the ALBA party are producing. However, when indigenous people do challenge Morales' policies, they're depicted as manipulated by foreign NGOs and not as truly indigenous. Morales' regime attempted to impose a hegemonic vision of indigeneity as loyalty to his government. To be an indigenous person, an indigenous citizen, you would be loyal to the government. The government is of the indigenous people and for the indigenous people. You have to be part of us. If you're not part of us, you can't have the label indigenous. He also said, if you're not with the official party, MAS, at the time, you are the opposition. If you are opposition, then you are right-wing of the racist fascists, which sounds a little bit like some Corbynistas on Twitter. But because of the power of social movements, Morales has not been able to impose visions of the people as one. However, Morales has overturned the two-term limit, holding a referendum in 2016 on whether he should be allowed to run for a fourth term, which was narrowly defeated. The Supreme Tribunal of Justice of Bolivia ruled that, in contrast to the Constitution, all public officers would have no term limits, blaming American imperialism for the nullification of the referendum's decision, thus allowing Morales to run for a fourth term. So, although he talks a good game about bringing people in, he's not exactly a respecter of liberal democracy. In the case of radical populism, Chavez purposefully aimed to export his models of political transformation and their ideologies not only to Latin America, but to the world at large, generously funding politicians and social movements. The wave of radical populism was influenced by Chavez's script of political transformation. It is evident that Chavez's model was emulated and adapted in Ecuador and Bolivia, where leaders conveyed constitutional assemblies, concentrated power in the executive, enacted laws to regulate the content of what the privately owned media could publish, regulated NGOs, and co-opted independent social movements. These self-described Bolivarian nations also claim to be implementing policies to reach a different form of development based on the ideology of socialism in the 21st century, and forged the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples as an alternative to US-led free trade agreements. As with previous waves, radical populism was unstable. Its nationalism, anti-imperialism and redistribution rested on the high price of commodities. These were hyper-personalistic regimes, and as Chavez's death illustrated, charisma could not be transferred to a hand-picked successor, and so more authoritarianism and more populism was required. So, as you've probably noticed, the cases discussed so far have all been from Latin America, or Southern America. This reflects the lack of scholarly attention paid to Central America, Mexico down to Panama. This is changing. So there exists a complex constellation of populist instances in Central America. In Costa Rica, the Partido Liberación Nacional is typically held up as a populist vehicle, but on closer study is argued to be a typical social democratic reformist party which engaged in liberal democratic institutional autonomy building measures using some populist methods. We also see clear cases of recurrent emergence of populist leaders in Panama and Nicaragua. These three societies in the region do not seem to have been fertile grounds for the emergence of populism. Guatemala and El Salvador, involved in radicalized and polarized struggle in the framework of Cold War strategy, and Honduras, where reformist waves were led in the context of traditional domination by political elites. And so, we recognize a dividing line between El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras, where there seems to be no populism at all, and Nicaragua, Costa Rica and Panama with indications of populism. In the non-populist camp, El Salvador and Guatemala stand out, where hegemonic social and political structures resisted attempts at reform and stifled mass protest through increasing repression and militarization from the 1970s to the 1990s. Contrastingly, the combination of authoritarianism and mild reforms characterized the Honduran scene, obviating major outbreaks of violence. In the other set of countries, can be divided into two different constellations, right? On the one hand, Costa Rica, where populism was subsumed under the logic of a party system working effectively due to the commitment of charismatic leader Don Pepe Figueres and his personal commitment to representative democracy. On the other, Panama and Nicaragua, where leaders follow populist strategies both rhetorically and organizationally to sustain themselves in power. The recent style of doing politics in Nicaragua recreated that pattern as Daniel Ortega came back to power in November 2016 for a third term in office, still projecting social rhetoric while following top-down strong personalistic tendencies, albeit tampered by pragmatism in macroeconomic policies. Looking at these cases, it seems that, at least until recently, researchers largely ignored the occurrence of populism in Central America. Even if not universally present in these countries, there are important cases of populist leadership in Central America. Indeed, it's the case that regions with varied populist successes could be more helpful in identifying the cause and consequence of populism than in regions where populism is either never present or consistently present, because it allows us to compare and contrast between different cases. Likewise, there's much variance in the incident and forms of populism. In some instances, populism was a tactical means towards institution building, right? As was the case with Figueres in Costa Rica, because it's an attempt to unite people into buying into institutions. In other cases, populism has been part of a leader's personalistic and authoritarian strategy. As in the cases of Arrayas and Torrelejos in Panama and of Somoza and Ortega in Nicaragua. And then there's Mexico. As you will know, Mexico recently returned a populist left-wing president in Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO. AMLO holds an idealized version of Mexico's past. In this case, the era of nationalist, inward-orientated development during the 60s and 70s. Ideologically, he argues that the state should play a greater role in the country's economic development and that more should be done to include Mexico's most marginalized and disenfranchised groups in the political process. The high indigenous makeup of Mexico has a role to play in supporting left-wing populists relative to right-wing populists. Unlike, say, Brazil, which returned a right-wing populist in Jair Bolsonaro, Mexico was a major pre-Columbian population centre, which has meant that most of the population is of indigenous or mixed-race descent rather than descendant from European colonisers. Mexico's white population is small, just 15%, and although they are disproportionately wealthy, this means that the white supremacy feelings evident in places like South Brazil is less electorally salient in Mexico. And one thing I think to bear in mind, similarly compared to Brazil, Mexico has one of the lowest levels of evangelical populations. Evangelical voters typically support socially conservative candidates, which is helpful for the populist right, not the populist left. Now, when it comes to AMLO, it's also important to remember that he's not like some sort of Corbynite figure of social, economic, environmental liberalism or whatever. He's actually where he's not necessarily environmentally friendly in that he prioritises economic development over perhaps the protection of the environment. And he is quite authoritarian as well when it comes to things like law and order. So it's important to not just instantly ascribe Western, European or British kind of understandings of modern left-wing politics to these actors, because they are materially different in many respects. As we mentioned in the week on left-wing populism, Mudd and Rovira Kaltwasser argue that left-wing populism in Latin America is inclusionary, in contrast to the exclusionary populism of the populist radical right. So what form does that take in the case of Latin America? According to Raúl Madrid, populist leaders in Latin America traditionally avoided ethnic appeals. The classical populist leaders in the region sought to win the support of indigenous people and Afro-Latinos, but they appealed to them as peasants or workers rather than members of ethnic minorities. And so perhaps this could be articulated as, talking about class, not identity politics. Radical populist leaders, on the other hand, did introduce ethnic elements to their campaigns. They forged close ties with ethnic movements, they recruited indigenous and Afro-Latino leaders to their party, and they embraced ethnic symbols and demands. Moreover, ethnopopulist leaders in Latin America have typically reached out to indigenous people and Afro-Latinos without excluding white and mestizos who have traditionally dominated politics in the region. So what do we mean by ethnopopulism? So this section is pretty long. You might want to break it down into a few listens. So, ethnopopulism. Madrid defines ethnopopulism as a discourse and political strategy combining ethnic and populist appeals. Ethnopopulists wed ethnic appeals to populist strategies of anti-elite sentiment and personalistic messaging, invoking the symbols, demands and interests of specific ethnic groups. However, as we know from Mudd's analytical framework, supply of ethnopopulist leaders needs to be met with demand from voters. For Madrid, populist leaders have embraced ethno-racial appeals in a large part because of growing ethno-racial consciousness in the region. Democratization, the debt crisis, and the wave of neoliberal reforms that followed the crisis spurred the rise of indigenous and Afro-Latino movements that have helped revitalize indigenous and Afro-Latino identities. However, these populist leaders have not simply appealed to ethnic group at the expense of others. Latin American populists have opted to be inclusive, in part because of widespread ethnic mixing that has blurred ethnic boundaries and reduced ethnic polarization, making it possible for ethnopopulists to win support across ethnic lines. By contrast, in some other regions, high levels of ethnic polarization and a paucity of ethnic mixing have made it difficult to assemble inter-ethnic coalitions. Think, for example, across the Middle East, some African states, or some Asian states. So we have a brief history of, it's not brief to be honest, a history of ethnopopulism. Early classical populists almost never recruited indigenous or Afro-Latino people as candidates for important elected posts or leadership positions in their parties. They rarely advocated indigenous or Afro-Latino causes, such as the teaching of indigenous languages, the combating of ethnic or racial discrimination, or the extension of indigenous land and water rights, nor did they promote ethnic identities or organisations. Instead, they downplayed ethnic or racial differences. The appeal of ethnopopulism was based on their socio-economic class rather than their ethnicity. Populist leaders wooed black and indigenous voters with populist platforms and rhetoric, as well as clientelistic handouts. They denounced the political and economic establishment. They presented themselves as saviour of the people and the embodiment of change. In short, populist leaders used the same strategies to appeal to ethnic minorities that they used to attract other working and middle-class groups. This changed during the 1990s. Populists embraced many traditional demands of indigenous and Afro-Latino communities, including multicultural education, indigenous land and water rights, anti-discrimination measures, and the recognition of indigenous languages. They also undertook symbolic measures, from using ethnic clothing, languages, and music in their campaigns to calling for their country to be recognised as multilingual and multicultural. Perhaps the most famous of these leaders is Evo Morales in Bolivia, who we mentioned earlier, who made ethnic and populist appeals the centrepiece of his political and his governing styles. We've spoken about Bolivia a lot, so we also see similarities in the Ecuadorian party of Pachacutic, which similarly embraced ethnopopulism during this period. It nominated a well-known personality from TV as its presidential candidate, and it supported the leader of a military rebellion as its presidential candidate over the course of 12 years. Both of these candidates ran traditional populist campaigns with some ethnic element. In Peru, we see ethnopopulism in the cases of Alejandro Toledo and Ollanta Humala. Toledo, for example, described himself as a cholo, often a pejorative term for an urban person of indigenous descent, and invoked numerous indigenous symbols, even going so far as to include an indigenous ceremony in Machu Picchu as part of his inauguration. And these leaders in Peru used populist appeals extensively, denouncing the political establishment and elites, presenting themselves as the incarnation of the people and the defender of the poor. Toledo was more a neo-populist than a classical populist, however. He supported market-orientated policies and maintained close relations with the US. Humala, by contrast, started out as a classical populist, denouncing neoliberalism and foreign intervention, but over time he moderated his rhetoric and platform. In Venezuela, Chavez combined ethnic and populist appeals. Chavez was the first president of Venezuela to recognise his African ancestry, and his government established ties to many Afro-Venezuelan as well as indigenous organisations and leaders, and also promoted multicultural education, recognised indigenous rights, and created a Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, including a Vice Minister for African Affairs. So we can see that ethno-populist appeals, like populism, can be found in a range of different ideologies. And they've worked for the most part, these appeals. Ethnopopulists drew a large proportion of their support, disproportionately from traditional populist constituencies, such as poor and politically disenchanted mixed heritage voters, who were attracted by their populist appeals, but also won large shares of the indigenous vote and, in some cases, the Afro-Latino vote as well. And so their ethno-populist strategies helped to fuse together a winning coalition of voters. And so why did Latin American populism become ethno-populist? Well, traditional Latin American populists divided the world between the masses and the elites, not between different ethnic groups, and they emphasised anti-establishment, personalistic and redistributive appeals. For much of the 20th century, ethnic identities in the region were suppressed. Latin American governments carried out nation-building projects that aimed to assimilate indigenous people and Afro-Latinos and build a single national identity. Governments eliminated questions about race or ethnicity from their census, and ethnic or racial terms largely ceased to be used in governmental operations. Indigenous people were recast as peasants, for instance, and the teaching of indigenous language was encouraged. It was discouraged. Many governments also actively promoted ethno-racial mixing, and some of them encouraged immigration from Europe to whiten their populations. Social discrimination against indigenous people and Afro-Latinos led many of them to embrace their mestizoed identities, particularly those in urban areas. In the 1980s, however, ethnic identities and movements began to re-emerge in Latin America. The rise of ethno-consciousness stemmed from the return to democracy in the region, which provided greater opportunities for self-expression and political organising. Many indigenous Afro-Latino leaders and communities took advantage of the increased political space to organise ethnic movements, and they were supported in many instances by international organisations that moved into the region on a large scale. in this period. Populist leaders have also sought to capitalise on and increase ethnic consciousness in the region by establishing ties with indigenous and Afro-Latino leaders and movements, and by wooing indigenous and Afro-Latino voters. Indigenous people and Afro-Latinos represent an obvious constituency for populists because they are mostly poor and socially and politically marginalised and economically marginalised. They're often politically disenchanted as well. Indigenous people, for instance, had weak ties to the traditional parties in many countries, which led to high levels of electoral volatility and a party system fragmentation in indigenous areas. As a result, they have often proven receptive to anti-establishment, clientelistic, and redistributive appeals of populist leaders. Moreover, the addition of ethnic appeals to the populist repertoire further enhanced the attractiveness of populism to indigenous and Afro-Latino voters. So ethnopopulism in Latin America has taken a more inclusive form than ethnopopulism in Europe or the United States for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to begin with, immigration is much lower in Latin America than in Europe or the United States, in part because Latin American countries are less developed and thus used as less desirable places to immigrate to. The principal ethnic minorities in Latin America are not recent immigrants, but rather groups with deep roots in the region. Indeed, indigenous people arrived in the Americas long before Europeans did, and Africans were brought to the Americas shortly after the European conquest. By contrast, Europe and the United States have received numerous waves of immigration in recent decades, and these immigrants have brought foreign customs and cultures to their new countries, and they've competed with native citizens for jobs, and they've sometimes been associated with poverty, criminality or terrorism, all of which have provoked a nativist backlash. Populists in Europe have fed on this anti-immigration sentiment, using exclusionary anti-immigrant appeals to woo political support amongst the native population, particularly from poorer and less educated sectors of voters. Ethnopopulism has been more inclusive in Latin America than Europe because Latin America has lower levels of ethnic polarization, high levels of mixed ethnic heritage, have blurred ethnic boundaries in Latin America and reduced ethnic polarization. Indeed, some scholars have argued that Latin Americans do not identify with specific racial or ethnic categories at all, but rather place themselves on a racial or ethnic continuum, ranging from indigenous or black on one side to white on the other, or European, with a wide range of categories in the middle. The low level of ethnic polarization in Latin America has reduced the attractiveness of exclusionary ethnic appeals for populist politicians as well as for voters. Indeed, politicians and political parties have used exclusionary ethnic appeals, such as Felipe Quipse in the MIP in Bolivia, have fared poorly. There's not really demand from voters for exclusive ethnic appeals. So the consequences of ethnopopulism for democracy in Latin America has been mixed, kind of like the impact of populism across the board. On the one hand, the ethnically inclusive nature of ethnopopulism in Latin America has strengthened democracy, right? Ethnopopulist leaders in Latin America have sought to incorporate politically marginalized ethnic groups, recognize ethnic rights, and address ethnic inequalities. They've helped to boost political participation and satisfaction with democracy among indigenous people and Afro-Latinos without worsening inter-ethnic relations. In Bolivia, for instance, indigenous people represented only 4% of the legislature in 93 to 97, but by 2009-2013, they constituted 25%, albeit all of them belonged to the MAS. The Morales administration reformed the constitution to mandate ethnic representation in the national legislature and national and departmental electoral tribunals. Similarly, in Venezuela, the Chavez administration's 1999 constitution set aside 3 seats for indigenous people in the legislature, and in 2007 the Chavez administration created a Ministry of Indigenous Peoples that provided a channel for the Venezuelan indigenous movement to shape government policy. On the other hand, the populist strategies that these leaders have employed have undermined democracy in the region as a whole. Populist leaders have traditionally sought to concentrate power in themselves, and the ethnopopulist leaders have been no exception. The efforts of these leaders to concentrate power and attack the political establishment have weakened horizontal accountability, debilitated the opposition and independent voices, and worsened political polarization. These latter strategies were widely used by Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, Guterres and Correa in Ecuador, and much less so by Toledo and Humala in Peru. As a result, democracy has been stronger in Peru in recent years than Bolivia, Ecuador and Venezuela. According to Freedom House, which is an organization which ranks the quality of democracy in a country, Venezuela's quality of democracy has dropped significantly during populist rule. The scores of Bolivia and Ecuador both began to deteriorate in the early 2000s before Morales and Correa came to power, but they've remained low during their administrations. By contrast, Toledo and Humala in Peru have shown more respect for democratic procedures. Indeed, Peru's Freedom House score improved sharply after Toledo took power in 2001, and it remained that level during the administration of Ollanta Humala. Finally, the relationship between ethnopopulists and indigenous movements has not always been smooth, especially with regard to the populist president's extra activist policies and unwillingness to share power. In Ecuador, for example, the indigenous movement protested the Correa's administration's 2009 mining law and its decision to strip the indigenous movement from its control of the country's bilingual education program. Relations between some indigenous organizations and the Morales administration in Bolivia have also deteriorated in recent years, especially in the wake of the government's decision to build a road through the Tipnis Ecological Reserve. Similarly, in Peru, the administrations of both Alan Garcia and Ollanta Humala repeatedly clashed with indigenous protesters over their extra activist policies. So the success of the left in Latin and South America can be traced to a few causes. The institutionalization of electoral competition in Latin America allowed for the left to come to power. Typically, authoritarian or military regimes did not allow leftist movements to flourish, and so if they won an election, they'd be removed by the military. It's not the case now. The fall of the USSR changed the global structure of left-wing politics. Revolutionary movements were out, and left parties embraced some form of capitalism, which increased their electoral appeal both amongst voters but amongst other elites such as business communities. The initially unsuccessful neoliberal turn in Latin America resulted from voter frustration. Left-wing movements were able to capitalize on this. And supported by the 2000s commodity boom, which allowed left-wing presidents to spend lavishly on social welfare programs. But when this boom finished, policies became unsustainable and supporters became disenchanted, eventually leading to the rejection of leftist governments. As a result, pink wave leaders have faced criticism from the right for high spending, from liberals for undermining democratic institutions, and for the hard or communist left, who argue that these leaders have to accommodate the basic rules of neoliberal development and US-led commercial regional order, as well as seeking to co-opt and divide more militant social movements. The Pink Tide's legacy, however, was not to replace neoliberalism in Latin America. The Pink Tide was never anti-neoliberal or anti-imperialist. Left-wing rule in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay and Chile have more in common with the social democratic governments of Western Europe, with a blend of free market economics and commitment to the welfare state. Indeed, only in the radical fringe of the Pink Tide, Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia and Rafael Correa of Ecuador, the bad left, according to Jorge Castaneda, was the main thrust of governance anti-neoliberal and anti-imperialist. Most left-wing governments were social democratic. Taking Cuba as a model, these self-termed revolutionaries nationalized large sectors of the economy, reinvigorated the role of the state in redistributing wealth, promoted social services to the poor, created interstate institutions such as the Bolivian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, which aimed to promote inter-American collaboration, i.e. the continent, and to challenge US hegemony. Still, the Kirchners in Argentina, Lula in Brazil, etc., they were still populists. And as we know, we can define populism as an ideology or a discursive phenomenon, but it's completely possible for them to fit in with a range of ideologies. And so we have the populists on the hard left or the bad left, according to Jorge Castaneda, and then people like the Kirchners and Lula, who were kind of on the good left, right? Populist but social democratic, perhaps. And then we can also see on the next slide how the pink tide has kind of crashed, right? And we now see a right wing or a blue tide almost, with a lot of countries falling to the centre right by 2009. Moving to the relationship between populist leaders and their followers and supporters, there are four key linkages to be aware of. The first is populist organisation. Similarly to populism in other areas of the world, populist organisations are based on low levels of institutionalisation, where leaders set their agendas and strategies centrally, and it's difficult to build identities that differ from the image of the people as constructed by populist leaders. Even though populists actively organise supporters within their movements, these organisations are based on insularity, as they do not promote solidarity with similar organisations in civil society. Populist organisations do not value pluralism because they adopt the idea of the people as everyone. You can't have pluralism, you can't have disagreement when the people are one, because they're supposed to be homogenous. Hence, the people can only be organised under organisations that are loyal to the leaders. Yet, sometimes, common people use populist organisations, the openings of the political system under populism, and the rhetorical claims that they are the true representatives or holders of nationhood to present their own demands. Chavez, for example, used organisations such as Bolivarian circles, small groups of 7 to 15 people intended to study the ideology of Bolivarianism, to discuss local issues and defend the revolution. Not to protect democracy, but to create clientele networks, nodes in a network, and used to spread patronage. These were replaced with communal councils and have faced the same problems as the Bolivarian circles, namely the persistence of clientelism in the exchange of social services for political support, based on a charismatic style of rule that neutralises or prevents autonomous grassroots input. However, there have been some more bottom-up organisations, such as urban land committees and technical water roundtables, which have opened up space for grassroots organisations to have influence. However, it's not the thriving, pluralistic, localised civil society dreamed of by liberals. There's the broader issue of clientelism. Populist parties and movements are organised through formal bureaucratic party networks and clientelistic informal networks that distribute resources, information and jobs to the poor. Early studies on political clientelism show that the poor were not irrational masses that voted for populist demagogic candidates. The poor voted instrumentally for the candidate with the best capacity to deliver goods and services. In addition to offering material rewards, populist exchanges go further with a discourse that portrays common people as the essence of the nation. In addition to exchanging material goods for votes, populist networks also generate political identities and provide a sense of self-efficacy. There's the media as well, right? So Latin American populists were media innovators. Eva Perón used the radio to communicate directly with her followers, transforming politics into a melodrama where she staged her love to the poor. Populists creatively blended exposure on television with traditional mechanisms of vote gathering, like mass rallies and clientelistic networks. Some, like Carlos Menem, were innovators. Following the example of Pope John Paul II, he visited common people in their neighbourhoods in his Menemobile, basically Menem car. His image had more in common with a religious leader or a show business celebrity than with a typical politician campaigning. Hugo Chavez and Rafael Correa developed weekly television programs where they informed citizens about their government projects and policies. They'd set the news agenda for the week and simultaneously entertain the public by singing and mocking their political enemies. Like other populists, they had conflict with privately owned media, and so they decided to close it and censored critical media venues. They created laws and institutions to control what the private media could publish and to sanction the infractions of journalists and media owners. Fujimori used corruption to silence journalists and to create tabloids that supported his government. As a result, journalists and media owners self-censored their publications and the quality of debate in the public sphere deteriorated. And so populist discourse. Post-structuralists argue that discourse is the primary terrain within which the social is constructed. That's Laclau. Scholars who do not accept the epistemological and ontological assumptions of their post-structuralist peers also consider discourse as a defining trait of populism. They claim that this particular way of framing social reality produces antagonistic conflict between groups and constitutes identities. As we all know now, what needs to be researched is who is excluded and included in this discursive construct, who has created these categories, and what are the levels of social and or political polarization produced by populist discourse. Populist rhetoric in Latin America historically constructed the people as urban and mestizo, ethnically and culturally mixed, who had an antagonistic relationship with the oligarchy. The populist creation of a virtuous nation, however, excluded those of indigenous and African descent until ethnic populism kind of addressed that and saw a constituency that was waiting to be talked to and brought into the political sphere. In order to belong to the people and to the nation, indigenous and Afro descendants were encouraged to adopt national mestizo values, to reject cultural specificities, and to whiten themselves. Raúl Madrid uses the term ethnopopulism, as we covered, to explain why, or explain the process in which populists could use inclusionary ethnic appeals to bring these voters in after years of being ignored both by mainstream politicians and other populist actors. Despite this, populist narratives empowered common people who have endured humiliation in their daily lives. Populist leaders have symbolically dignified the poor and non-whites or non-European heritage who are portrayed by the elite and the media as the rabble, the embodiment of barbarism. They give people a sense of positive self-esteem and a sense of being a valued member of the political community, a space left open by their non-populist rivals. So the most common explanation for the absence of populism in some nations in Latin America are strong party systems, functioning liberal democracies which uphold the rule of law. And this is resting on the argument that populism is a result of crisis of political representation. It emerged when excluded people without partisan loyalty were enfranchised for the first time. In some countries, like Colombia and Uruguay, traditional political parties incorporated the previously excluded. You can see this happening in the UK as well, with the extension of the franchise and the Liberal and Conservative parties seeking to co-opt new voters, right? Especially under, say, like Disraeli or Gladstone, who is persona non grata around Liverpool campus, but still was a great prime minister. And then for those who couldn't be co-opted by the main parties, the Labour Party emerged to speak for them. Right? In other places, this doesn't happen because there's not an institutionalized party system. Right? So in some countries like Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Venezuela, Mexico and Peru, new Labour-based populist parties and political movements arose in opposition to the oligarchic political establishment, and they reconfigured party systems around elite and popular socio-political cleavages. In Ecuador, populism emerged with Velasco Ibarra in the 1930s and 40s, but he didn't organise followers in stable parties or organisations of civil society. And so a second crisis of political representation was produced by political systems such as Venezuela's two-party system, when it became unresponsive and unaccountable in the 1990s. Hugo Chavez rebelled against closed, self-interested and self-reproducing cartel parties. A third scenario for a crisis of political representation occurs when political competition becomes highly personalised. So what you get there is political competition becomes polarised between personalities who claim to better represent the true instincts of the people, or true interests of the people rather. Under these conditions, a series of populist leaders, political outsiders and personalistic leaders in Ecuador and Peru, for instance, emerged and rose to power. Now, a different argument, rather than a breakdown or a inability of established party systems and the rule of law and liberal democracy to function, is forwarded by De la Torre, who argues that the poor implementation of citizenship rights aids populist mobilization. So, for example, there's a duality between the official recognition of rights in constitutions and the rhetoric of state officials, and the weak implementation of these same rights in everyday life. The rule of law is tenuous at best, and at worst, the law serves only to serve the interests of a powerful few. So not all forms of legal, political or socio-economic exclusion give rise to populism, right? But in the absence of or discrediting of mechanisms of political mediation and institutions of representation, populist interventions that give name to and politicize people's daily experiences of marginalization and humiliation remain a constant possibility. Nations where citizens perceive the rule of law protects them from the state and the powerful, such as Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, tend to be free from populism. And I think we can kind of see this in Western Europe as well, right? We typically argue that populism amongst liberal democracies is new, right? In some cases it's a bit older, but typically from the 1970s onwards it emerged and really picked up in the last decade or 2 decades. And for some people that is because in the previous era, say the post-war era in democracies from 45 to say the mid-1970s, party systems and the rule of law typically work quite well. And it's only after that with kind of economic decline, economic stagnation, that populists began to get a foothold. And that's a thesis. You might not agree with it.